normally FBI and NYPD. So my squad was FBI NYPD task force. Two of the squads, the Gambino and the Lucchese's, were out in Queens. The other three families or squads were in Manhattan. And so each squad had a family. Now there was a lot of interplay, so we knew everybody under the other. Our sister squad was the Gambino squad out in the RA. They were the Gotti squad, which was the Gambino family. And at that time,
hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Jim Fitzgerald, Fitz for short. With me, as always, is my friend and comrade, Ray Carr, also retired Philadelphia, FBI, Dr. Ray Carr, he insists I call him. And every guest is a special guest, but our producer likes to write this up that we have a special guest tonight, and he is, and he's a friend of both of ours, Bobby Chacon, retired FBI, dive team founder of the FBI. He has so many stories to tell and so many interesting aspects to his career. We're going to try to squeeze it all in this particular episode. But on top of that, Bobby, you've done something recently that I've never done. And Ray, have you ever sat on a jury in a homicide trial?
No, I've been on the other end all the time. I've never had the chance to be on the end that Bobby was on.
yeah.
Well, guess what? He was on a homicide trial. And later on, we're going to get into that experience. Can you give us like 25 words or less, Bobby? Kind of a teaser summing it up for our audience. What was it like? About 5 months, right?
Yeah, 27 years in law enforcement and a lawyer. I have my law degree as well. So both of those things normally keep me off a jury. And for somehow, and the defense did have preemptory challenges, they could have gotten rid of me, but they decided to keep me on. And look, I was fair, and I was just as impartial as any other juror, I like to think. So yeah, we can go into that.
I knew one other agent in New York. He was actually still an agent in New York, living in Jersey, and he was brought on and as a jury member there. I don't think it was a homicide. It may have been a civil matter, but that's pretty rare. They like the older retired folks that maybe don't have the professional backgrounds, most defense attorneys anyway. But we'll get more into that as we go along. But again, Bobby, thanks for showing up. We're on a text kind of thread together, and we comment on different things. We do like to talk a little bit about current events. And Bobby, I know you commented on the news, and by the way, you're on all the different news channels when it works in your schedule. But just yesterday, we had a leak of the Nashville, at least part of the Nashville. They keep calling it manifesto. I know manifestos. This is more of a journal, a diary. Maybe there's more coming of it. But Bobby, let me start with you. Just a few bullet points. What I know you read at least those 3 pages. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it was the little bit we know that was leaked, and there's a lot more from what I understand. There's a lot more journals on his laptop, her laptop. I actually don't even know which way to refer to them, but
It's okay.
the laptops, and there's many more journals. But what was leaked seems to be a highly agitated, angry person, angry at white people and rich people. It seemed to be kind of a class, race kind of warfare type of diatribe that the parts that I read. There are people in this country that want to divide us by race and by class. And it seemed like this but this person who was suffering from obviously some mental defect was manipulated by that narrative and took violent action based on that narrative, because it talks about crackers, which is obviously a derogatory term for white people. It talks about you khaki wearing white faggots. And obviously this is rich people. Like it's strewn throughout the things that I've seen so far, that this was a person that was, very much tied up into the race and class warfare.
Ray, I want to hear your information too on this, or your opinions. Bobby, do you think this whole thing, minus addresses and names, do you think the rest of it should be published and get it out there for other people to look at?
Absolutely. I mean, in almost every other case it is. And I think that they've held on to this long enough, saying that it's an active investigation. Well, I think you need to tell the people how it's an active. Show us why, because I think that's a disingenuous reason. And I think that you need to show us how, now that it's starting to get released and maybe it'll all come out. Tell us how it was an active investigation. Tell me what part of this thing that's now released was part of an active investigation. What were you doing actively that the public couldn't benefit? Because it all benefits the public when we know more about somebody that does something like this. We learn whether we could do we can help people like this in the future, things like that, and like I said, in almost every other case, they are released. So what about this particular case and this particular journal was such an investigative value to you that you kept it, because people had to sue. There's still lawsuits to release this information, and they've always hid behind the active investigation. Well, now it's time to prove what part of it is, and if it wasn't, then someone was lying to the public, and someone needs to be held accountable.
I agree with that. I agree.
Whoever the deep throat is in the Nashville criminal justice system, going back to, of course, the Watergate reference there, I'll say it out loud. Thank you. And we'll see if more comes. And also, if there's going to be an investigation as to who was the leaker, maybe if we're lucky, it'll be the same team that investigated the Roe decision leakage from a year or so ago, because that never went anywhere. But Ray, any closing comments on this whole Nashville thing?
I do. You talk about leakage. That's exactly what this journal is. I mean, the date of the journal is February 3rd. The date of the shooting is March 27th. That's 52 days or more than 7 weeks. You can't tell me in that time period that although you're espousing this in writings, that you're not also espousing it on social media. You're telling your friends, your parents. People know. This behavior isn't something. She didn't wake up on the 27th of March, or he didn't wake up on the 27th of March and say, hey, I think today I'm going to become a mass killer. I'm going to go to this school and just start shooting people. I hate these type of people. No, this is what's building. There's always a pathway to violence, and the leakage is there, and people ignore the warning signs, and they ignore them here.
Yeah, Ray, and I forgot to mention that I've seen where even in the journal it says I should have been caught numerous times, especially in the summer of, I think, 2020 or 2021.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Mentions that. And so the word now it's further leaking out that the police had been to this person's house. The principal knew that this person posed a threat. This person, the shooter, was actually caught previously several times in the school parking lot with weapons. And they either lost their nerve and didn't go through with it. But that person who ultimately wound up being the shooter had been previously caught in the parking lot of that school with weapons. And so I think that maybe they're holding on to all this because they realize somebody is going to have to account for this.
Well, we're seeing a pattern. Look at Parkland, look at Nashville, look at Maine. There's been warning signs all the way through and through. The police have responded to all of these instances and did not do anything. Now, I don't have all the information, so I'm not going to crucify the cops in this, but we need to do a better job at recognizing this behavior and dealing with it. We really do.
Yeah, it's a shame because I think in the end, people look at these as problem kids and we should try to help them as much as possible. And up until they've committed a crime, which a lot of times is the actual big event itself. But like you said, there's leakage beforehand. There's if they had access to weapons, that should have been curtailed. That should have been cut off. If they, maybe we have to start considering more involuntary institutionalization of people beyond a 72-hour hold. I mean, the laws need to change so that the law enforcement, because look, everything rolls downhill. They're failed by their parents. They're failed by the school. They're failed by social services. And the uniformed cop is the last person in line. And they have to deal with it then ultimately, right, at a school while the bullets are flying. And so all these failures, they can hide behind their bureaucratic administrations, but the cop in the street is the guy that actually has to deal with it. And so I think that there needs to be tools of those, if those bureaucrats are going to hide behind, we need to be given tools to better kind of take these people out of these situations.
Yeah, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but I really get tired of hearing people saying we need to curtail the guns. We need to take the guns off the street. It's a misnomer. And really, this is not a gun problem. This is a mental health problem. And we need to start dealing with that. I don't know why we're not. I mean, how many times we have to see these things happen before we stand up and start dealing with the real issues here? I mean, you could put a gun, you can lay a gun, you can have a gun that sits on a table for weeks and it doesn't do anything until somebody picks it up.
And we've seen attacks before. I mean, look, we saw knife attacks, 11 people killed, I think, in the UK. Yeah. We saw a truck attack in France where they used a rental truck to mow down 75 people. People that are hell-bent on violence and hurting other people, they'll find a way. You have to get the person out of that situation. If it's an institution, if it's in jail, whatever it is, you have to get the person, because if they don't have access to guns, they have access to something else that's going to hurt somebody, a knife, a truck, whatever it is. They're going to find a way. I mean, Oklahoma City happened without a gun. Okay, there was no gun at Oklahoma City.
That's true. That's true. You know, they call these people active shooters, and really what they should be calling them is active assailants, because they're not just using guns, like you just said. They're using knives, axes, bombs. They're using vehicles, trucks. They're using all these different types of things.
Yeah.
So,
we all agree this thing should be released. So the motivation of these types of future shooters, to me, the investigation is solved. I get it. They got to tie up some loose ends. Who are they talking to? Where did she get the weapons? Whatever. But we also want to know more about the motivation. Certainly, as a behavioralist, I want to know what drives people. I don't care if they're part of the mass culture or if they're little parts of the subculture that this person may have been in. And maybe some people were afraid to kind of tap her on the shoulder and saying you're doing something wrong. And we have to talk to you and institutionalize you because she had some protection that, for whatever reason, society seems to be giving certain people now. But when it comes to guns and violence, there's absolutely no excuse for that. So I think the three of us are in agreement there. So I do appreciate that. Bobby, let's turn to you and your career. We kind of like to walk our audience through the early days of our folks. Now, you come from a law enforcement family. You grew up in, was it Queens, New York?
Oh, Long Island.
Long Island, okay, just along, not far from Queens.
Right.
Give us a little bit of your background, your family situation, and because eventually you wound up in the FBI. But give us a little pathway there to your success.
Yeah, I mean, all four of my grandparents were born in Europe, two in Italy, one in Spain, and one in Ireland. And my parents were first generation. They were from Queens, and as happened back then, as you got a job and you started a family, you moved out to Long Island. It was cheaper. You can get a house with a yard. And my dad was NYPD. My mom was a nurse. My brother became NYPD. My sister became a nurse. So they followed the parents. Those two are like kind of legacy. Law enforcement is a legacy, and so is kind of nursing. And so so I grew up on Long Island. I was the third of four kids. Very classic suburban upbringing. Nothing special. Middle class, working class neighborhood on Long Island. And then I did well in school. I just happened to be the third of four. And so my brother and sister kind of, broke all the rules ahead of me. And so I was the good kid and I did well in school. And I got a scholarship, a full scholarship from the Navy to study nuclear engineering at Georgia Tech. I graduated high school at 16. I went to Georgia Tech. I was young, too young, actually, in retrospect. So I studied nuclear engineering and had every intention of going into the nuclear Navy. It was 1980. Ronald Reagan had just been elected. The defense budgets were ballooning. So engineers and anybody but the Navy was getting many, many job offers and stuff. And so, I walked through the NROTC office first day, and there's a picture of President Carter, who had just left office, because people don't know. People always associate Jimmy Carter with the Naval Academy. But he was a transfer to Annapolis. He actually did his first 2 years at Georgia Tech. He was an engineering student at Georgia Tech, Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
And then he transferred to Annapolis. And then so Jimmy Carter's picture's on one wall, and then the other wall was John Young, who was the first shuttle pilot. He was an aeronautical engineer at Georgia Tech, and he was the first shuttle pilot. So the space shuttle was happening. And so it was really a heyday of engineering, the defense budgets. And really, I was right in the middle of that. I was in the Navy. I did a couple of my summer tours on ships. But in the end, the academics were too rigorous for me. Graduating high school early didn't give me the opportunity to get my advanced placement courses in math and science that I needed to succeed in that rigorous nuclear engineering program. And so I transferred to the University of South Florida, where my parents had relocated to in Tampa, got my business degree, went back up to New York, got my law degree at Hofstra University out on Long Island, which you know very well because you've been there.
I do.
And then I went right into the FBI. I actually took the NYPD test. I was on the list to go NYPD. My brother was a few years ahead of me on the job. And I had every intention to go in NYPD. And then the FBI came around at a career day. So I was a little interested. I talked to my dad. Then I went to visit my dad. My parents in Florida. Had a long talk with my dad. And my dad's actually the one that steered me into the FBI. He goes, the feds it'll be more varied. You'll have, probably a little better money, a little more travel, a little more, a little more variety. He was afraid that, that I'd get bored. I wouldn't have. I would have loved a career in NYPD, but my dad's the one that kind of encouraged me. And my dad he was a cop in the 60s and 70s. It was a turmoil time. He went through the NAP commission, NYPD. The NAP commission was really, Serpico and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And he was a little soured, I think, my dad, towards the end of his career. And so he said, go with the feds. It'll probably be a little bit of a better course. And, and then I enjoyed every day of 27 years I spent in the FBI. Great friendships, and professional collaborations.
Bobby, before we move on to FBI, you told me a few months ago of a very moving story about your father while in the NYPD. And I think your mother got a phone call or a knock at the door. Can you walk our audience through that?
Yeah, so this was in the early 70s. I was probably 10 or 11 or 12 years old. And I remember because the way our house was, my room was right next to my parents' room on the first floor. My sisters and brother were upstairs. My dad was part of a special unit in the NYPD. So at this point in time, I remember cops were being executed. The SLA and a couple of these black radical groups were actually executing cops, black cops, white cops, no matter what. And I think they had 6 officers executed in a short period of time. So, my dad was on this special unit going after these really hardcore, radical black militant groups. And, here I am, a 10 or 11-year-old kid. Now, remember that there's no cell phones, and there's no, even the neighborhoods my dad worked, the pay phones were all broken and stuff. And so, and I'll tell you, just to back up a little bit, I get triggered a little bit. I was triggered in 2008, I think it was. Remember, actually in Philly, the 2 Black Panther types standing outside a voting hall, a polling place.
They were
holding their weapons.
Yeah, the weapons, the black leather, and all that. That was a trigger for me because those were the kind of people that I had in my mind that were killing the cops ultimately. And and I've had other triggers like that. BLM, when all that BLM started, you saw some people like that. Yeah. And so, as an 11 or 12-year-old kid, I remember one night we're on the 11 o'clock news, and I'm almost in bed, and my mom's watching, and it comes over the news that 2 police officers were shot and killed that night. Now, that's all they give. And they say, they give the old tried and true, we're not identifying the officers pending notification of next of kin, right? And so, so this is 10, 11 o'clock at night probably. And my mom, I can hear my mom crying, and then she gets a phone call, and I hear her talking, but it's muffled. And it turned out to be one of the other wives of somebody in my dad's unit. And she said, I haven't heard. Have you heard? So all the wives are now calling each other. Have you heard? And there's no cell phone. Nobody's calling. And so, you could I could remember hearing the clock ticking on the wall, tick, tick, 1:30, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., waiting and not knowing if the next phone call is going to be my dad or it's going to be a knock at the door with notification next to kin, because we know it takes a few hours, for them to happen, and they have to drive out to Long Island. So you're standing there. I remember laying in bed, eyes wide open. My siblings, by the way, were upstairs sleeping because they didn't hear most of this. My mom had the TV on in her room, and I was next door, and I could hear her crying and sobbing, and I just laid there. The fear was palpable. It still kind of bothers me to this day, and just the clock ticking and knowing there's either going to be a doorbell ring or a phone ring, and either one could be bad news. And ultimately, I don't know, it was probably 3:34 in the morning that my dad was able to get to a phone back at the station house and call my mom. And then I could hear my mom talking to my dad. I get choked up a little bit even thinking about it, but I can remember my mom, and then I knocked on the door. She didn't even know I was still awake. And then she grabbed me, and we had this huge embrace, and she was crying and breaking down. And it was just one of those life moments, man, that I still remember. Yeah. And then, like they said, when I saw those 2 guys standing outside that polling place in Philly, it bothers me. It bothers me, because of that, because these guys were out there killing cops, and my dad was right in the middle of it. Luckily, nothing happened, but he was on the scene. I later found out he was on the scene of those 2 cops that were killed, and he was doing, everything that they needed to do. So calling home, it's just not a priority at that point. You know what I mean? It is, but it isn't. He had it in his mind. The minute he could get to a phone, he was going to make that call. But when you're in the middle of it and two cops are laying there with their heads blown off, cops are cops. There's other priorities right away and stuff. And so, so that was one of those life events that you never forget.
Wow.
No happy ending, because 2 officers, of course, were killed, but at least within your household, you had the privilege of your dad and your mother's husband coming home that night. Of course, your siblings are upstairs. They didn't know a thing, but that's probably a good thing.
They didn't know anything. The next morning when my dad walked in the door, my mom and him had this huge embrace. And then, then they found out through the news, because then my parents were, my dad came home and then my mom went to work as a nurse. She worked the day shift and dad worked the night shift. So they kind of tag teamed, and then mom she had just enough time to give us breakfast and run to work. Dad got us ready for school, and then he went to sleep. While we were at school, he slept.
Now, it may be a little different today with cell phones, but I guarantee you there are wives and spouses and husbands of police officers out there that they may hear something went down, and they still have to wait an hour, maybe even 2, until someone calls. And they may be calling their spouse's cell phone, but for whatever reason, just like your dad, he was working the case, maybe still protecting himself, quite frankly, and his colleagues. So we like to give, again, this is not a good story per se, but we like to let people out there know this is the life of a law enforcement officer. This is the life of his or her family. And defund the police and, all cops are bastards, all this stuff you hear about. These are human beings. And here's the son of a police officer and later, FBI, we're going to get into that. But Ray, we've had a few of our guests on tell us stories somewhat similar to that, one way or the other. And I think it's very moving. And I hope it translates well to our audience out there, that how difficult it is to be a family member of a police officer.
Well, I said this before. I'll say it again, and I'll say it over and over again. We have the only job as law enforcement officers, other than firefighters and U.S. military, where when we walk out the door in the morning, our family doesn't know if we're coming back. And that's a really true statement. Every single day we walk out, even us as FBI agents, we weren't succumbed to some of the dangers every day, day in and day out, that the local city police and the local police are, because they're making those high-risk stops and going to domestic violence calls. But we still have the dangerous situations, but we just don't know. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going to happen. And that's the thing.
You're right, Ray. It's not that. So obviously FBI agents get killed at a smaller rate than law enforcement. But 100% of us face the same danger.
Absolutely.
That's the thing. 100% of us, like you said, every FBI agent, almost every, unless they've got desk duty and they're working a violation that doesn't require that. But most of us, walk out the door every day with that danger. I mean, I worked drugs and gangs for a number of years. We all worked those violations that require that.
Right?
My wife still remembers me, putting on a vest at 3 a.m. and leaving the house because, an informant said there's a deal going down. And we have to rally the troops and stuff. It's just nature of the business. You forget about it a little bit, and it becomes almost instinctive to us. But we have to remember our families back home, because they're not.
I agree. I know, running out in the middle of the night, phone call comes in, you're sitting down 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, you're finally relaxing, phone call comes in, you're back out the door. Mm-hmm. And you don't come home till the next morning when everybody's getting up and going to school. Yeah. I get it. Yeah.
So, Bobby, what year are we talking? You law degree, applied to the Bureau, and you're at Quantico. When are we talking? What year?
1987. So I started law school in 85. I did it in 2 years. It's usually a 3-year program, but I did law school in 2 years. Finished in 87. I literally graduated law school August of 87 and entered the FBI Academy in September of 87, like 3 weeks later. I had applied early on, like a year and a half before, right? The background investigation and stuff. So they were doing all that while I was in law school. And then the timing just worked out perfectly for me. And they had a slot ready for me. I got the call, I think, in May or June that I had a class, 87-18. And so I finished in August, and I took 2 weeks vacation, and then I went to Quantico September 13th, 1987, 87-18.
And that's right around when the Bureau was starting. You could go back to New York City. Is that what you did?
That's right. So back then, uh, you couldn't go back to the office you processed through. Process meaning where you applied and where they did all of your basic paperwork. Most of the time, that was where you lived, and so you couldn't go back to the office where you processed through. That was the general rule. New York was the exception back then, at the time when I was in Quantico, because it was so hard to staff, and people would, do 2 or 3 years in a small office, say St. Louis, and then they would be transferred to New York. The cost of living was so high, the wives didn't like it, whatever reason. And so you had a lot of people quitting when they got transferred to New York. So they had to kind of figure out a way to incentivize people to go to New York. So the first thing they did was say, well, anybody from New York that wants to go back because your family's there and whatever, you can go back. And that was the first thing. This is before they had some financial incentives. They said, if anybody wants to go back to New York and you process through New York, we'll lift that policy restriction and you can go back to New York. And so I think 5 of us from my class put in to go back to New York. And so in Quantico, there's this kind of tradition that about the 8th week mark, about the halfway through your training, you get your first office of assignment, where you're going to go when you graduate Quantico. And if you have no idea where it is, they ask you to put your preferences down, but nobody really put too much credence in the fact that they listen to what
true,
you want. And so everybody puts Tampa and Phoenix, like these small offices that have great style of living, standard of living. But so everybody gets it, and they make you open the envelope in front of the whole class and go, oh, I'm going to Anchorage, or I'm going to whatever. And it's a shock to people. They don't have any idea. But the 5 of us that chose New York, we were kind of, we knew where we were going. So they made us get up there and read it, but everybody kind of laughed because we knew we had requested to go back to New York, and, you were guaranteed at that point to go back to New York. So I knew where I was going.
Well, let me ask you this. There was a rumor, and tell me if this rumor was true. I came in the late 80s, probably a little bit longer than the year after you. Early 80s, I was 89 too. But a lot of the guys, and it was the same thing. If you wanted to go to New York, you can go to New York. But when I got my orders to Buffalo, it wasn't New York, but it was Western New York. But they would talk about agents in New York that were coming out of the academy, and even agents that had been there for a couple of years that were on food stamps. They couldn't afford to live in the city. They had to move way out. Some were living in Pennsylvania so that they could afford and travel. Jim, you were one of those. But is that true? Were there really agents on food stamps?
I had heard that too. I had heard it about San Francisco, and the way I heard it was that there's an income level right below which you qualify for food stamps. And I mean, back then, I don't know what the Bureau, I think it was 35,000, 37,000. It was like a new agent, GS10, agent or something, some crazy low number. I think that in New York and San Francisco, whatever that starting salary was for agents was below that line that you could qualify for food stamps, I think. Yeah. But then shortly after I got there, they started incentivizing it in other ways. We got the COLA, we got a housing allowance, but you're right. A lot of guys I know lived out in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, was a very common place for New York agents to live. So people have to understand, that's 3 states. That's 2 states away. So you're traveling, you live in one state, you're traveling through another to work in a third. So that's 3 states, basically, you're traveling to. Every day, you're traveling through 3 states to get to work and back. That's quite a burden.
And that was my benefit was I never had to move because I was a cop in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So I raised my hand for New York, and luckily I got it. They told me with my 11 years as a cop under my belt, if I didn't raise my hand for New York, I'd probably be sent to an Indian reservation somewhere because I have the street experience, the arrest experience, and I could hit the ground running on a 2 or 3 agent resident agency there. So I said New York. So for 7 years, 2 hours up, 2 hours back every day. I loved it. Good memories.
I'm glad you mentioned that. People should understand, your listeners should understand that Indian reservation work was the most dangerous work in the Bureau. And they had a lot of problems staffing it. Nobody wanted to go to Indian reservations because you were more likely to get killed on an Indian reservation as an FBI agent than you were in inner city New York or Detroit or Chicago, because it was that dangerous. Number one, you're out there pretty much on your own. There's very little backup. You're working with maybe one partner. And it was just the Wild West and stuff. And so people, I remember seeing one time Durango, Colorado. Men's Journal had it as one of the nicest places to live. But there was an RA there. There was a small FBI office there with 3 agents assigned, and nobody wanted to go there. It was actually a hardship office at that time. And it was a hardship office because 90% of the work was Indian reservation work. And that's why they wanted cops with street experience to go to those places, because they were extremely dangerous places to work.
Well, we lost 2 agents, Kohler and Williams, out in the Dakotas with Leonard Peltier in the late 70s.
Who's
For
now
just that, what you just said, Bobby.
Yeah.
Exactly what you just said.
Yeah. No backup. They were ambushed. Yep. They were slaughtered.
They were executed.
Yeah, executed, totally. And desecrated.
And he's a cause celeb to this day. There was one of the earliest days of when law enforcement was just, insulted back then by, and there's still actors and celebrities that are singing his praises. Mumia Abu-Jamal in Philadelphia, who killed a guy I knew, Danny Faulkner, in the early 1980s, a Philly police officer. But anyway, so we're getting kind of away from that. But Bobby, you moved back. Were you still living in Long Island? Did you go to the 26 Federal or the LIRA? Where did you wind up?
No, what happened was in typical New York fashion, as soon as I had the official paperwork in my hand, I went to basically it was called FOAC, was Field Office Administration and Communication. That was the class. My FOAC instructor was a former New York agent. And so who was kind of a really kind of guy that you knew had connections all over the place. And so I went to him at lunch one day and I sat in his office and I go, look, because again, people should know that when you first go to New York, you were going to get to an applicant squad, and nobody wants to work applicants. It's like interviewing, and you're not arresting anybody. So the game was to avoid applicants if you could. So I went to this guy and said, hey, look, I'm a New Yorker. My dad and brother cops. I'm going back to New York. Is there anything you can do for me? And he immediately picked up the phone and he called an ASAC named Jules Bonavolanta. And as old as I am, Jules' son, I think, was the SAC in Boston recently or something. Mm-hmm. So that's his son. So my ASAC, so he picks up the phone and says, hey, Jules, I got this guy. He's a New Yorker, And so Jules, my first day in, I walk into Jules's office in Manhattan and he goes, where are you from? I go, Long Island. I'm staying with my brother right now until I figure out where. He goes, oh, I have a squad out in BQ, which was the Brooklyn Queens RA, the Metropolitan RA, they called it, BQ MRA. And he says, you want to work the Mafia? And I said, oh, I'd love it. Of course, And so I was so there was a Long Island RA, which was much smaller. There were less openings there. But I got right into the Queens RA, which, by the way, was bigger than most field offices in the FBI, just the RA was. So I got on an organized crime squad targeting the Lucchese crime family at the time. So I cut my teeth on wiretaps and informants, the typical mob stuff that you'd see in movies.
And walk us through that. There's 5 families in New York, Lucchese being one of them, Gambino, Bonanno. Who are the other 2? I'm drawing.
Colombo and Genovese.
There you go. Mm-hmm. And a lot of murders.
To each one. There's a whole squad, normally FBI and NYPD. So my squad was FBI NYPD task force. 2 of the squads, the Gambino and Lucchese's, were out in Queens. The other 3 families or squads were in Manhattan. And so each squad had a family. Now, there was a lot of interplay, so we knew everybody under the other. Our sister squad was the Gambino squad out in the RA. They were the Gotti squad, which was the Gambino family. And at that time, Gotti had just taken over the family. He had just killed Paul Castellano at Spark Steakhouse. And so it was a real hot time for organized crime. Sammy the Bull, all of this stuff was happening while I was there. One of my first assignments, I remember, was sitting in a conference room redacting, which is taking a black pen and getting rid of names and addresses and phone numbers for Martin Scorsese's assistant, because they were in the final stages of a script for Goodfellas. So Goodfellas, the movie, was based on my squad. So Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta in the movie, Henry was an informant on my squad. He was pinched by C-13, which is the Colombian drug squad downstairs. And then they said, hey, we got this mafia guy. We don't know what to do with him. He was working with the Colombians. Do you want him? And of course, we took him. And then we ran with him. We put Henry back into the family and stuff. And so Henry was so what you saw in the movie, they changed the names of everybody except Henry Hill. I don't know why, but so Paul Sorvino was the head of our family. He played a guy named Polivario, which was really Vic Amuso in real life. But so what you saw in the movie Goodfellas was kind of what I was doing. Eddie Maloney, who was the U.S. attorney, head of the strike force, the organized crime strike force at the time, is actually in the movie. He plays himself in the movie. And so that's what I did. Wiretaps, following wise guys around, working informants, the traditional great up. We had dictation machines. We did not have computers on our desks. We had reel to reels, the old Revox machines, reel to reels with the pedals that you could listen and stuff.
Yeah.
The pedals and backup, and so that was really a great way. And my partner was a detective, an NYPD detective, and it was a great couple of years just learning the job from old timers. Who most of the old timers that I got broken into at that time got their creds directly from Mr. Hoover because they were old enough to have come in the late 60s. And now it was the late 80s.
I have two questions for you, Bobby. Number one, whatever happened to Henry Hill?
Henry, well, I think he passed away, I think. I mean, he was around. He was on Howard Stern. He was like a regular on Howard Stern for a while. And I mean, he became like a mini celebrity out there. I mean, he wasn't, I don't know why or how he did it. Henry was a bit of a character and stuff. And so he was very, you would think a guy in witness protection would do a better job at laying low, but he didn't care after a while, I guess. And I used to hear him on Howard Stern and roll my eyes and go, Henry, what are you doing? But I should confirm that. I don't want to say it if he's still alive, but I think he passed away now.
And number two, did you ever get a chance to work with your brother?
Yes, on two occasions, because my brother went on the PD in 1980, so he was a couple of years ahead of me. And in 85, 86, crack basically exploded in New York City. And so the crack was out of control. And, like everything else in law enforcement, we kind of play catch up when something new comes along. And so the PD out in Queens, because Queens is where it took off, Manhattan was still mainly heroin, but crack really sprouted up in Queens. And so they formed what was called the 101 crack unit, 101st, like airborne and stuff, 101st crack unit. So my brother got assigned there. And then I was doing a couple of drug cases downstairs in the RA with the Colombian drug squad, just because as a new guy, you want to do everything you can on all the squads, And so
right.
my boss would let me do that. And so there were two that I remember, two particular, one of these roundups, the 300 person roundups and stuff. And it was jointly with the PD and stuff. And so,
we should take them over the Brooklyn Armory, right? That's where we would process them.
Fort Hamilton, and
yeah.
And so like there were two where like my team and my brother's team, they weren't a task force, but they were married up because this big thing, everybody had to kind of, send people and stuff. There were two different ones of these big, massive roundups where my brother and I literally were kind of going up the stairs together and going through a door together. It was pretty fun.
That's cool.
Nice. That is nice.
Now, at some point, you moved from the sort of Italian mob to the Caribbean mob, right? Jamaican gangs?
Yeah, Jamaican posse. So a couple of years into the work in the mob, believe it or not, it was a little slow for me because, those guys were really slow. And I came on the bureau, I was 24. And so if I was the second youngest of my class, the average age of my academy class was 29 and a half. And so I was young, I was single, I was, living in New York. I wanted to go. And so word comes down one time, hey, they're forming this new squad. Unfortunately, it's in Manhattan, but it's going to be really fast paced. They're going after these non-traditional organized crime groups, Jamaicans, Asians, all these different gangs and stuff. And it was supposed to be like one of these really kick-ass squads. So I said, you know what? It's time for me to try something new. And I raised my hand and I got assigned to the squad. It was in Manhattan, which I wanted to go back to headquarters anyway, because I think I was missing a little something, not going there first. I didn't know a lot of the office people because I was out in the RA and stuff. And so it gave me a chance to go back into Manhattan. Again, I was single. I didn't care about the hours. I would work 18 hours a day and be happy with it. I was, partying and stuff. And so I got on this squad and I just fell into, I had another NYPD detective, second grader, Tommy Bruno, an amazing detective, learned a ton from him. And him and I went out to Brooklyn where he used to patrol when he was in his uniform days. And he taught me the streets. He introduced me to guys in the precincts and informants, and we just rock and rolled. And over the next 10 years, I worked Jamaican posses. I became the FBI's leading expert in Jamaican. They sent me to Jamaica. They sent me to the UK. They sent me to Canada. I testified before Canadian Parliament as an expert because they were fashioning their own version of RICO, and that's what we were doing in Eastern District of New York, the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. I was turning one RICO case after another. My first indictment, I was 3 years in the bureau, 4 years in the bureau. I had 54 people indicted in one indictment. We did 36 search warrants in one night. most of them in Brooklyn, but also Albany, New York, and Dallas, Texas. We took down this huge case. Yeah, it was quite so that was my kind of my rock and roll time. We were doing 2-3 warrants, drug search warrants a week. It was really a fast paced thing. It's really what I was looking for. And that was some of the fun. That was really some of the fun stuff.
Bobby, on the right next to the bank robbery squad, C-19 was C-9, the fugitive squad. And remind me, there was a guy, I think he was Jamaican by birth.
Mm-hmm.
I forget his name, but I think when some of these wires, and I'm sure you got the language down before long, but this guy, you'd hear some of these wires, meaning, the wiretaps, if you will, recording these phone calls, and he would listen to them. Oh, yeah, he means this, he means that. Do you remember who I'm speaking of?
Was it Billivan Johnson?
No.
There was two guys. There was two Jamaican-born agents, Billivan Johnson and Wilford Baptiste.
Wilford, yes.
Yeah, both of them were Jamaican-born agents. Billivan actually wound up being my undercover for a long time. Him and I really got along well together, and he was a great undercover. We put him with the mob. We put him with the Colombians, and everybody bought him. He was literally born and raised in Jamaica, so he was the real deal. I mean, you couldn't, we would have wiretaps on the Italians, and he would meet with them and leave. And Billy was the most gentle guy you'd ever meet. I mean, he was, but when he turned it on,
it happens.
He turned it on, and
that's what editing's all about.
And can I still go? Yeah. So he was the most gentle guy, but when he turned it on in his persona, we would have him leave, and then we would listen to the Italians, and they were all afraid of him. They were like, "Man, that guy's a killer," and it was just Billy. We knew Billy as this gentle guy. And then we did Island Green, which was a joint case with Miami Division. Andy Bland was the case agent down in Miami, and we did cocaine for green cards. One of those cocaine for green cards, we indicted 119 people where they were bringing in cocaine and trading them for green cards, and we were giving them temporary green cards over the course of a year. And then when we were going to bring them in for the real green card, that's when we took the whole case down. And I remember, man, from like 7 a.m, we had a whole suite of rooms on one floor in the Holiday Inn at JFK Airport, and they would come in one after the other. Groups in small different groups would come in 3 and 4 guys at a time. And we had this suite. We had the tactical team was in the bedroom of this suite. They would come in. They'd give us the cocaine. We'd give them their final green cards, and we take it down.
Freezing up a little bit. You good there, Bobby?
Yeah, I'm good. You hear me?
Okay. Yep.
Little freeze there, but that's right. That's what editors are for.
Yeah.
We have great producers.
We had this whole system set up where we'd take them down in the room, and then we'd shove them across the hall and process them. And then we had a team in the parking lot, a team in the lobby, and the teams upstairs, and they were coming in like they were scheduled all throughout the day. It was like amazing. And of course you get these little hiccups. We didn't know. Sometimes there were guys that would arrive with their kids, and so we'd lock them up, and then we had to have 2 agents get a different room on a different floor. And this is how the funny thing, you guys will appreciate this story. So a different floor, I had to get 2 agents to just babysit the kids, right? So we got 6 or 8 kids, ranging age from 5 to 10 or 12. And at the end of the case, it's my case, right? So I'm doing all this stuff. And the end, like a month later, I'm dealing with the hotel receipts. And they rented like 6 or 8 movies during the course of the day, Disney movies, to keep the kids. Well, I got somebody at finance at headquarters saying, "We're not paying for movie rentals." I'm like, "Well, you don't understand." Like, they gave me such a hard time. It was months before I could get payment for the movie rentals because they were Disney movies. You don't understand. They had kids in the room. We didn't know what to do with the kids. We couldn't call social services until the end of the day. And it was just one of those typical bureau stories where like finance was not going to pay that bill. Not pay the extra money for the I had to get all kinds of approvals, SAC approval, and it was just a round and round and round.
That's great.
It was just one of those crazy things.
It's better they were Disney movies than porn movies for adults you were trying to get reimbursed for. Because we all babysat those guys who wanted to keep busy at night, and you had to justify those bills. Now, Bobby, you're a kid from Long Island, New York City. You're busy with school, law school. We're going to segue a little bit. Somewhere you got into scuba diving. Did it start out as a personal thing? But you're a master now. You teach it around the world. This guy founded the FBI dive team. We're going to get into that. But how did it all start with you from New York City?
I was a recreational diver. I took a class in college because it was 3 credits and it was fun and stuff. And then I started diving in the Caribbean. In New York. You just thought you join a dive club, and then you kind of maybe dive around Jersey. Jersey is very challenging diving because a lot of shipwrecks, but they're deep and it's tough diving. If you want, most of us that dove in those areas, we dove really easy stuff, and then we would go to Caribbean a couple of times a year with 40, 50 people from a dive club. You'd all go into one of these big resorts and you'd spend every day diving. So you'd dive a little bit during the summer, and then you'd usually have 1 or 2 big vacations during the year where you'd go to the Caribbean and dive. That was my extent of my diving. And then in 1995 or 96, the FBI New York office had pretty much the only sanction. There was some other diving in some other offices, but it was the only sanctioned dive team in the FBI, and it was in if you remember, our Special Operations Division. New York had an SOD, and Kallstrom was the leader of it then. And then so it was all tech guys. It was all TTAs. It was a very quiet, very under the radar type of team. But they got so busy that in 96, 95, they opened it up to the criminal division, and they were very hesitant because the cat was going to get out of the bag. They basically doubled the size of the team. It used to be 6 just TTAs with a little gig, and then they opened it up, and then they brought in me, myself, Brenda Heck, Mike Timms, a bunch of other criminal people, and we went on to the dive team. And then because they got so busy, they needed us. And then throughout the late 90s, it kept getting busier and busier and busier. But I got on the team in 95, and a year later, we were down in Atlanta diving in Lake Lanier for the rowing events because they had a 20,000 person stadium built on the water and stuff. And so the substructure went down 40 feet into the water. So we would have to dive it and search it and make sure nobody planted any bombs on it and stuff. But half the team was down there 2 weeks early and practicing. And then I was scheduled to go down. Friday night, July 19th was the opening ceremony of the Olympics. So I was scheduled to go down Thursday. Well, Wednesday night, July 17th, 1996, TWA Flight 800 explodes off the coast of Long Island. It was a 747 bound from JFK to Paris, but only about half full. It was grounded. It was delayed leaving New York. Very hot, humid July night. They had the air conditioners pumping to keep the passengers comfortable. And when they finally took off, they got to about 13,000 feet. And they
Hey, Bobby.
Yeah.
Bobby, can we stop you there? We're kind of running out of time on this segment, and I want to bring you back and talk about that. I think this is a great place for us to do that, and then we'll come back next week. So I want to thank you for sharing this incredible career with the FBI with us, Bobby, and we're going to be signing off here, and I want everybody that's listening to subscribe to Code Red Podcast and follow us all on the Code Red Podcast social media platforms at coderedpodcast.com. We'll see you next week, and we're going to have Bobby come back. Take care, everybody.